A racist cop tried to arrest the wrong black man inside a courthouse without having a single clue who he really was, and within seconds, something happened in that courtroom that made everyone go completely silent. A moment so sharp, so shocking, it shifted the air in the room. Because in the blink of an eye, the man who had just been publicly humiliated turned around and revealed a truth so powerful, so untouchable, it left that same officer defenseless, stripped of his authority, and standing on trial for his own disgrace. But before the karma exploded, there was the moment of humiliation. And that, you need to feel. He was standing quietly in the hallway, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, polished shoes, holding a confidential folder with the golden seal of the Department of Defense on the front. He wasn't late. He wasn't lost. He wasn't suspicious. He was supposed to be there. But none of that mattered to the officer who spotted him, glanced at the color of his skin, ignored every piece of identification in his hand, and made one deadly assumption: he didn't belong. The officer approached fast, eyes full of arrogance, hand already reaching for his holster. He didn't ask questions. He didn't check names. He looked this man dead in the eyes and said the words that would set off a chain of events that no one in that courthouse could have imagined. You think just 'cause you got a fancy suit and a fake badge you can fool me? This area's restricted. Hands where I can see, M. Now. A pause. People turned their heads. A woman gasped from the elevator. A clerk stood frozen in place, holding a stack of documents. And the man, calm but burning inside, replied with a voice low and controlled, "Officer, I think you're making a mistake." But the cop was already grabbing his wrist. "No, you made the mistake. Thinking you could impersonate a federal official. That's a felony. You'll be lucky to walk out of here." That was the moment the folder hit the floor, scattering papers marked top secret. That was the moment the cameras caught everything. That was the moment humiliation sank into the man's chest like a knife. Because he could have said something right then. He could have stopped it. But he didn't. He wanted people to see. He wanted them to witness what it looks like when power blinds a man so deeply that he can't recognize who stands in front of him. He let the officer tighten the cuffs around his wrists. He let the whispers spread across the courtroom walls. He let the lie grow. Until someone finally spoke up. "I think you should check the name on the file." It came from a court officer. Someone who had recognized him, barely able to hide the panic in her voice. But the officer waved her off. "Mind your business. He's going in." "Sir, I really think," I said, "step back." And so he was marched through the lobby, hands bound, surrounded by a sea of shocked faces and silent witnesses. Every step he took echoed with the shame they wanted him to feel. Every glance he received reminded him of the assumptions painted onto his skin. No one asked his name. No one dared to intervene. Because in that moment, the uniform had more authority than the truth. He was dragged past the courtroom where he was scheduled to give a national briefing on internal security threats. The place where top officials had been waiting to meet him. Where his presence had been personally requested by a federal judge. He walked past it like a criminal. Because the man who thought he was doing his job had already made a decision. One based not on fact. Not on protocol. But on bias. The kind that runs so deep, it becomes invisible to the one who carries it. Inside the holding room, the officer began processing him, laughing under his breath, asking if he wanted a phone call, then joking that there probably wasn't anyone important he could call. The man didn't speak. He didn't argue. He didn't scream. He just stared back. With the kind of silence that makes you wonder what someone's holding back. That silence was about to break the floor beneath them. Because not more than 5 minutes later, someone burst through the holding room door. A tall man in a gray suit, with the look of pure authority on his face. He wasn't flustered. He wasn't yelling. But he had papers in hand. Real ones. With real clearance. And when he looked the officer in the eye, he didn't blink. Do you have any idea who you just put in cuffs? The officer stammered something about protocol, procedure, confusion. But the damage had already been done. And when the man in the suit dropped the file on the table, flipped it open, and pointed to the ID, there was a visible shift in the room's temperature. The officer looked down. And that's when it hit him. The man he had humiliated wasn't just anyone. He wasn't a clerk. He wasn't an imposter. He wasn't a mistake. He was the highest-ranking black official in National Defense Intelligence, a decorated veteran, a security strategist who had walked through more top-clearance doors than that cop would see in a lifetime. And right now, he was the only person in that building with the authority to decide what happened next. But what did he do? Did he retaliate? Did he explode? Did he ruin the man on the spot? No. He stood up, slow, calm, and with the weight of every injustice he had ever swallowed settling on his shoulders. And what he said in that moment was not loud. But it cut. Now, officer, would you like to read me my rights, or should I read you yours? Everything froze. Every sound in the room disappeared. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to dim. And the silence that followed? It wasn't just silence. It was reckoning. The fallout that followed that moment would shock the entire building. Public apologies. Internal investigations. Policy reviews. But none of that would compare to what happened to that officer, because what came next wasn't just discipline. It wasn't just suspension. It was justice, live, undeniable, and poetic. But the real question is, what exactly did that man do after the truth came out? How did he respond when power was finally on his side? And what happened to the officer in the minutes that followed, will leave you speechless. Are you ready to hear what justice looks like, when the tables finally turn? Stay until the end. You won't want to miss this. Before we begin this powerful story, we want to take a moment to speak directly to our black viewers and listeners. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism. We see you. We hear you. Your voice matters. Your life matters. And your dignity should never be questioned. This story is for you, a reminder that justice has a voice, and sometimes, it echoes louder than we expect. Enjoy the journey ahead. And if stories like this speak to your heart, make sure to subscribe and be part of our growing community. Now, let's begin. His name was Elijah Brooks, and from the very beginning, nothing in his life had come easy. Born in Montgomery, Alabama, raised in a modest two-bedroom house by a single mother who worked double shifts at the local hospital, Elijah learned early what it meant to be overlooked. To be judged before he spoke. To walk into rooms and feel eyes narrow before his first step landed. But he also learned something else, something that would later define him more than the obstacles he faced: composure. Not silence. Not submission. But composure. The kind that sees the fire but doesn't rush to stomp it out. The kind that waits, calculates, and speaks only when it matters most. That ability, refined over decades of climbing the steepest ladders, would become his most powerful weapon. By the age of 35, Elijah had already served in 2 international military missions, earned multiple degrees in cybersecurity and political science, and built a reputation within federal intelligence as the man who could walk into chaos and come out with clarity. He didn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone demanded attention. Not through intimidation, but through certainty. The kind of certainty that only comes from knowing who you are in a world that constantly tries to define you as something less. He had no need to boast. He had no time to chase validation. His work spoke louder than any title, and his influence stretched far beyond the visible layers of the courtroom he was about to enter. Washington, D.C. that day was buzzing with political tension. The courthouse, a tall gray structure wedged between 2 historic buildings, was hosting a high-level closed-door hearing regarding potential breaches in homeland infrastructure. Elijah wasn't just attending, he was the keynote. The room had been reserved under a different name for security purposes, and his arrival was intended to be discreet. A black SUV had dropped him off at the side entrance, where a metal detector, a list of scheduled attendees, and a hallway lined with security officers awaited him. It was supposed to be seamless. Routine. But routine has a way of crumbling when prejudice gets in the way. The hallway itself smelled of polished marble and stale paper, a blend familiar to anyone who's walked the halls of bureaucracy. Civil servants moved in and out of rooms with coffee cups, bundles of papers, and tired eyes. Among them was Officer Ray Dempsey. Middle-aged, mid-level, and convinced he was sharp enough to sniff out trouble before it started. He wore the uniform like armor, badge gleaming, belt tightly buckled, eyes scanning with suspicion rather than protection. He'd been with the courthouse for over a decade, and in his mind, he'd seen it all. But what he hadn't seen was someone like Elijah, someone who looked like that, dressed like that, walking with that kind of calm authority, and actually belonging in a place like this. Ray didn't know Elijah. He didn't check the roster. He didn't ask for ID. All he saw was a tall, confident black man stepping through a secure hallway with a briefcase and a calm that, to him, read as arrogance. He didn't hear the courtesy in Elijah's voice. He didn't notice the Department of Defense seal on the folder. All he saw was a challenge. And to him, a challenge had to be shut down. Elijah's morning had started like any other. Up by 5:30, a quiet jog, black coffee, and a moment spent reading over the classified notes for the briefing. Nothing in his schedule prepared him for the moment when Ray stepped in front of him, eyes narrowed, hand resting firmly on the butt of his holstered weapon. There were no introductions. No questions. Just assumption. Elijah barely had time to greet the front desk clerk before he was being told he was not authorized to be in that hallway, despite having credentials that outranked everyone else in the building. The confrontation began like many do, small, tense, easy to miss if you're not paying attention. But tension has a way of snowballing when someone decides their pride is more important than the truth. Ray's voice was sharp, rigid, and loud enough for heads to turn. He accused Elijah of impersonating a government official. He claimed the badge looked fake. He demanded the briefcase be opened, right there, in front of everyone. Elijah remained still, composed, trying to de-escalate. He calmly asked Ray to verify his name with the clerk. He offered to present the digital pass on his phone. He even pointed out the clear sticker on his chest that indicated his security level. But none of that mattered. People began to watch. A young paralegal paused mid-step. A janitor leaned subtly on his mop, pretending not to look. Two junior attorneys stood frozen at the edge of the hallway, uncertain whether to continue walking. And Elijah. Elijah felt something rise in his chest. Not anger. Not fear. But familiarity. This wasn't the first time he'd been mistaken. Or profiled. Or challenged for simply existing in a space someone else decided he didn't belong. But this time, it was different. Because this time, the courtroom wasn't just a building. It was a stage. And what was about to happen would leave a mark that no one in that building would ever forget. Meanwhile, Officer Ray Dempsey had no idea the storm he was building. He saw none of the signs. Not the change in posture from the security staff. Not the tightening expressions from people who knew exactly who Elijah was. Ray was too wrapped in his own ego. He wanted to make a point. He wanted to show everyone that he ran that hallway. And so, in front of a growing crowd, he reached out and grabbed Elijah by the arm, pulling it behind his back to snap on a pair of cold steel handcuffs. The sound of metal clinking echoed through the hall like a siren. Elijah didn't resist. He didn't shout. He didn't move. But inside, something shifted. Back home, Elijah had a daughter named Nia. She was 10. Brilliant. Curious. Already asking questions about justice and fairness. He'd always told her to carry herself with grace, to never let ignorance define her worth. And yet here he was, being dragged through a government building like a criminal, all while knowing the truth, that his name, his rank, and his history would erase this moment with a single phone call. But he chose not to make that call. Not yet. Because sometimes, the world needs to see the lie before it can respect the truth. In the corner of the hallway, a junior analyst named David Collins stood watching. He'd interned with Elijah 2 years ago and immediately recognized him. His palms were sweating. He didn't know whether to speak up or stay quiet. The instinct to defend battled with the fear of retaliation. And that tension, that hesitation, echoed what so many feel when watching injustice unfold in real time. It's not that they don't care. It's that they don't know how to care without risking something. As Elijah was walked past the courtroom doors, his eyes caught the clock on the wall. He was supposed to be inside that room at that exact moment, briefing a federal panel on vulnerabilities in national security infrastructure. But instead, he was being led to a temporary holding room used for unruly guests or last-minute detainees. A place he had only ever seen on blueprints. And as the door closed behind him, he sat down slowly, breathing deep, not because he was afraid, but because the moment had finally come. He was done watching the system protect its own at the cost of dignity. He was done being silent. And very soon, everyone in that building was about to find out exactly who Elijah Brooks was. But first, he needed them to see their mistake with their own eyes. He needed them to feel it before he spoke a word. What happens next? The fallout. The revelation. The karma. And the moment that would flip the power dynamic inside that courthouse forever. Elijah sat in the holding room with his hands still cuffed behind his back, the cold of the steel sinking into his wrists, but not deeper than the weight sitting in his chest. There was no clock on the wall. No sound besides the muffled noise of courthouse doors swinging open and shut in the distance. He could feel every breath inside that space, measured, controlled, but beneath that stillness, a storm was forming. Not of fury, but of revelation. His eyes scanned the corners of the room, not searching for a way out, but simply observing, as if mentally logging every second, every detail, preparing for something larger than retaliation. He wasn't thinking about embarrassment or revenge. He was thinking about impact. Because what had just happened wasn't about ego, it was about exposure. The kind that cuts through systems like a blade. Outside, Officer Ray Dempsey leaned against the wall, smugness still hanging in his smirk as he updated his supervisor with a few half-truths and exaggerated assumptions. "Yeah, says he's here for some classified meeting," he scoffed, thumbing through the man's folder without care. "Has a fancy badge, but it don't look right to me. Probably forged." He got nervous when I approached. "You know how they get." His voice dropped slightly as someone walked past, but the tone remained soaked in judgment. Arrogance. Power misused. The kind that doesn't need permission to damage lives. Meanwhile, down the hall, the courtroom buzzed with low murmurs. Federal officers, analysts, and cybersecurity experts whispered to one another, glancing at the entrance. "He should have been here by now," said a tall woman in a navy suit, flipping through the printed agenda. This whole session was built around his report. "What the hell is going on?" Another attendee, younger, leaned in and said, "I saw someone get escorted by an officer about 10 minutes ago. Couldn't tell who it was, but they were in a suit." The murmurs spread. Tension grew. A Department of Homeland Security official quietly stepped out into the hallway, trying to discreetly contact Elijah's office. No answer. 2 calls. Then 3. Back inside the holding room, Elijah finally spoke. "Do you always open government documents without clearance, officer?" His voice was steady, without an inch of panic. Ray turned toward him slowly, as if still struggling to accept the authority in the man's tone. "I do what's necessary when things look suspicious," he replied, tossing the folder onto the table without care. "And you? You look suspicious." Elijah tilted his head slightly. "What part? The suit? The badge? The federal clearance sticker?" Ray's smirk twitched. The part where you think you can walk through this courthouse like you run it. That's what gets people caught up. Elijah leaned back in the chair, the cuffs digging in deeper now, but he didn't flinch. You're very confident about things you know nothing about. That's dangerous. Before Ray could respond, the door swung open and a man with a tablet stepped in. Officer Dempsey, he said, glancing at Elijah, then quickly back at the officer. Can I talk to you outside for a second? Ray furrowed his brow but followed him into the hallway, letting the door shut behind them. Their voices were muffled, but tension bled through the walls. Elijah closed his eyes briefly, exhaled, and waited. Outside, the official leaned in close. We're getting calls from DHS and the Deputy Director's office. They're asking why Elijah Brooks hasn't entered the courtroom yet. Apparently, he's the lead on the entire briefing and no one's been able to reach him. Ray blinked. Brooks? That guy in there said his name was Elijah, the official interrupted, eyes narrowing. That guy is Elijah Brooks. The Elijah Brooks. And if what I think just happened actually happened, you need to pray that man is in a forgiving mood. Ray's face began to pale slightly, but pride held him still. There must be some mix-up. His credentials didn't look right. The official didn't blink. I suggest you fix it. Now. Back inside, Elijah sat in silence, still bound, watching the doorknob twitch before the door creaked open again. Ray stepped in, face stiffer now, but still clinging to his authority like it was armor. He walked over, picked up the folder, glanced at the photo ID again, and swallowed hard. Looks like, there might have been a mistake, he muttered, fumbling for the cuff keys. You're free to go. He reached forward, but Elijah leaned away. No, he said calmly. You don't remove those cuffs until you explain to me, out loud, why they were put on in the first place. Ray hesitated, gripping the key tightly. Elijah stared directly into him. Say it. Or leave them on. I've waited longer for justice than you've spent in this job. Ray's lips parted, then clamped shut again. Finally, under the weight of that piercing stare, he mumbled, I assumed you didn't belong. Elijah didn't blink. Because? Ray's voice cracked slightly. Because you didn't look like someone who, he trailed off. Elijah didn't need him to finish. He stood slowly, the chain between the cuffs jangling softly. Now you can take them off, he said, and Ray did, hands trembling slightly. The metal clicked free. Elijah rubbed his wrists, then picked up his folder, straightened his suit, and walked out without looking back. Down the hallway, murmurs turned to stares as Elijah emerged. Heads turned. Conversations halted. The courtroom door opened with a quiet whoosh as he stepped inside. The judge raised her eyes, startled, then stood. Mr. Brooks, we were told you hadn't arrived. Elijah nodded slowly, walking to the front without apology. I was here, he said plainly, placing the folder on the table. I just had to pass a different kind of security clearance first. As he began his briefing, his voice carried a calm authority that left no room for question. Charts, documents, threat models. But beneath it all, the room could feel something different in his words. A subtext. A statement. Every eye was locked on him. Every mind, racing. They all knew something had happened. And the man now speaking wasn't just delivering intelligence, he was proving a point. That presence can't be judged by appearances. That silence can hold more power than shouting. And that dignity is not something anyone gets to decide for someone else. Outside the courtroom, Ray stood alone. Word was spreading. Whisper by whisper. He looked down at his hands, the same ones that had gripped Elijah's wrists, now oddly cold. He didn't know what was going to happen next. But he knew it wouldn't be good. And what Elijah had planned for the minutes that followed, would leave not just Officer Dempsey, but the entire courthouse, stunned. Because what was about to happen, wasn't just a response. It was a reckoning. Elijah stood at the head of the conference table inside the courtroom, now transformed into a high-security strategy room. The air was thick with quiet respect, the kind that didn't need applause or ceremony. The officials seated around him weren't just politicians or civil servants, they were decision-makers, men and women who shaped policy with the flick of a pen. The only sound in the room was the hum of the overhead projector as Elijah flipped through the slides of his classified presentation, each one containing layers of insight and critical data that very few in the building could even interpret. He spoke with precision, not wasting a single syllable. There was something about his posture, unshaken, rooted in a truth deeper than the words on the screen, that made every person sit a little straighter, listen a little closer. But as his voice flowed with poise, somewhere beneath the surface, something was quietly unraveling. Outside the door, the hallway no longer buzzed with activity, it had frozen into a cautious stillness. The whispers about what had happened before the meeting had already reached every corner of the courthouse. Rumors morphed into details. The man who had been wrongfully detained just minutes before was not only a decorated federal leader, he was the architect of a major counterintelligence division. And the officer who had put his hands on him? Still pacing the hallway, drenched in denial. Ray Dempsey hadn't moved from his spot since Elijah walked past him. His arms were stiff at his sides, eyes locked on the courtroom doors as if waiting for someone to burst through and tell him it wasn't real. But it was. And when the assistant from the judge's chambers approached him with a paper in hand and a short, clipped message, "You're requested inside," his throat tightened. He followed her, slow, heart hammering in his chest, not because of guilt, but because something in the back of his mind whispered that his time in that uniform had just expired. The doors opened, and for a brief second, every head in the room turned toward him. Not in greeting. Not in recognition. But in silence. The kind that swallows a man whole. Elijah paused mid-sentence, eyes lifting slowly, locking onto Ray's. There was no change in his expression. No shift in his tone. But something in his gaze made Ray feel like the entire weight of his own authority had been reversed. The judge, seated to Elijah's left, gave a short nod and motioned for Ray to step forward. No one spoke. Elijah turned off the projector, calmly set the remote down, and addressed the room. Before I continue, there's something that needs to be addressed. Not because I seek vindication, but because this room, this system, needs to see what accountability looks like when it isn't performative. The judge straightened, clearing her throat, but Elijah continued, steady and composed. I was detained and restrained in this building less than 30 minutes ago. Not due to a failure in policy, but a failure in perception. A belief that authority looks a certain way. That power only belongs to a certain face. That presence can be policed based on expectation rather than fact. His voice remained even, but it carried like thunder. I chose not to stop it when it happened. Not because I couldn't. But because the system often protects itself faster than it protects the truth. And sometimes, the truth needs a stage. The room stayed frozen. Ray shifted slightly, clearing his throat, trying to find some footing. I didn't know who you were, he said, not defensively, but like a man drowning slowly. It wasn't personal. Elijah looked at him directly, no malice in his eyes, only gravity. That's the problem. It's never personal. It's systemic. It's habitual. You didn't know who I was because you didn't think you needed to. You didn't ask. You assumed. And in that assumption, you weaponized your position. Ray opened his mouth, but Elijah held up a hand. Let me be clear. This is not about you. This is about every hallway like this. Every courthouse. Every office. Every moment where someone has to prove their worth before they're allowed to exist with dignity. I've been silent in a lot of rooms. But not today. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, I respectfully request that Officer Dempsey be formally investigated for racial profiling and abuse of power within this federal building. I also request that this hearing be paused to allow for this matter to be documented and included in the official record. The judge nodded slowly, eyes heavy, then looked at Ray. "Officer, your badge and weapon. Now." A gasp rippled through the room, not loud, but enough to be heard. Ray's hand hovered at his belt, frozen. "Ma'am, with all due respect," the judge's tone was cold. "You'll comply immediately, or I'll have you removed by security." His hands moved clumsily now, unfastening his belt, sliding the holster off, unclipping the badge. The click of the metal as he set it on the table sounded louder than it should have. Then he stepped back. Not a word. Just shame curling in the corners of his eyes. Elijah said nothing. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. Because this wasn't a victory, it was a correction. And it wasn't just his. The judge stood. "Officer Dempsey is hereby relieved of duty pending full investigation. This courtroom recognizes Mr. Brooks's testimony and acknowledges the misconduct that occurred within this building today. Let it be known that leadership comes in many forms, and is not dictated by the assumptions of others." Ray was escorted out slowly, the back of his neck red, his hands clenched into fists he didn't dare raise. The doors shut behind him, but the silence he left behind echoed louder than his footsteps. Elijah turned back to the projector, lifted the remote again, and calmly resumed his presentation. But what no one expected was what happened next. Because as Elijah clicked to the next slide, he paused again and said something that no one in the room could have predicted. Something that didn't come from authority. Something that came from experience. "Before I continue," he said, "there's one more file I need to share with the room." He pulled a separate folder from his briefcase, one not marked by any department seal. It was thin, worn, and paper-clipped with a note that simply read, "Eyes only." The judge raised an eyebrow. "What is that?" Elijah looked around the room, every face watching. "It's a record of every incident reported over the last 6 years in this building involving racial discrimination by internal staff. Including 3 previous complaints filed against Officer Dempsey. All of which were quietly dismissed." You could feel the air shift. Someone whispered, "Jesus." The DHS official near the back leaned forward. Elijah continued. "I didn't just come here to talk about national threats. I came here to talk about internal threats. The ones we ignore. The ones we protect. The ones that don't come in the form of weapons or intelligence breaches, but uniforms and unchecked power." No one moved. "I waited," Elijah said. "I waited because I wanted you all to see it happen. I wanted you to feel what it looks like when a man in uniform doesn't ask questions, because he already believes he has the answers. And I wanted to see what you would do when the truth walked back into the room." The room sat in stunned silence, each person wrestling with the weight of what had just unfolded. There was no applause. No dramatic music. Just consequence. Just clarity. And Elijah Brooks, standing tall in the middle of it all, knew that what came next would ripple far beyond that courthouse. Because now, the nation would have to watch. And what he was about to do, would not just be remembered. It would change everything. The folder Elijah placed on the table sat like a loaded weapon, silent and unassuming, yet filled with undeniable truth. The courtroom was frozen in a strange stillness, not tense, not relaxed, but somewhere in the middle, where breath seemed harder to come by and the ticking of the second hand on the judge's wall clock felt painfully loud. Elijah didn't rush. He didn't need to. He opened the folder slowly, deliberately, his hands steady, eyes scanning the room as if taking a final measure of who was really listening and who was simply present. The judge, visibly affected, leaned forward, her fingers laced together on the desk, her voice quiet but sharp. "Mr. Brooks, do you have evidence to support those claims?" Elijah's tone didn't shift, but there was weight now, a deeper gravity under his calm exterior. "Not only do I have evidence, I have timelines, incident reports, emails, statements that were never followed up on, and internal memos that were conveniently buried." He glanced down at the paper in front of him and continued, one of the earliest complaints was filed by a black attorney named Maurice Tenner. He was stopped 3 times entering this building within the same month. Each time, his ID was questioned, and his belongings were searched in full view of others, despite his full clearance. The official report listed him as uncooperative, though the video surveillance showed no sign of resistance. 2 months later, he stopped coming to the courthouse entirely. The judge's face hardened. The people in the room leaned in closer now, their postures stiff, uncertain of how to respond. Elijah kept going. Then there was Lauren Keene, a data analyst for Homeland Security. She reported a hostile exchange with Officer Dempsey that involved a threat of removal from the premises. She was told she matched the description of someone on the watch list. She never got an apology. Her report was quietly marked as unsubstantiated and never reached human resources. A low murmuring began to rise in the back of the room, but Elijah lifted a hand gently and it fell quiet again. His voice was even, but the emotion rising inside him was no longer subtle. This is not about isolated incidents. It's a pattern. And the reason it keeps happening is not because no one knows, it's because people in positions of power choose to do nothing. He paused, locking eyes with the judge, then the federal officials seated around the courtroom. How many more folders like this one do you need before silence becomes complicity? The room remained still. A woman seated near the back slowly reached for a pen and began scribbling notes. A senior intelligence officer whispered something to the man beside him, his expression pale. Elijah's next words came softer, almost like a confession. I didn't want to bring this here. I didn't want this to be the story. I came to brief you on infrastructure risks, to talk about cyber breaches and foreign interference. But you want to talk about threats? Let's start with the ones who wear the badge and forget the oath. The judge stood slowly, her expression unreadable, and said in a voice that tried to remain neutral but couldn't hide the tremble, Mr. Brooks, this changes the nature of today's hearing. I think we need to, but she stopped. Elijah had raised his hand again, not to interrupt, but to request space to finish what he came to say. He took a step forward, folder still open, and looked directly at the camera mounted in the corner of the room. Let this be part of the record, he said. Let every department watching this feed know that respect is not optional. That authority must be matched with accountability. And that we are not waiting anymore for change to come from the top down. At that moment, the double doors opened again. A man in a dark blue suit stepped in, followed by 2 uniformed agents. His presence shifted the air instantly. He didn't speak, but walked directly to the front row, handed a small envelope to the judge, and sat. She opened it, read quickly, and then looked up with a new sharpness in her eyes. This just came from the Department of Justice. An independent review has been initiated. Officer Dempsey has been placed on administrative leave pending full investigation. A formal statement will be made to the public within 24 hours. A soft murmur rippled across the room, but Elijah remained still, unmoved. Because this wasn't about one man losing his badge. It was about pulling the veil back on something far more dangerous. He turned toward the agents who had entered and gave them a small nod, acknowledging the weight of what was now moving beyond his control. But as he turned back to the room, there was a change in him, something different in his face. Not satisfaction. Not vindication. But purpose. From the side of the courtroom, a woman stood up. She was young, maybe early 30s, clearly nervous. Mr. Brooks, she said carefully, her voice just above a whisper, I was one of the interns who saw what happened outside the courtroom. I didn't know what to do. I didn't say anything. I should have. Elijah looked at her, his expression softening. What matters is that you're speaking now, he said. What matters is that we start telling the truth, even if we're late to it. The judge cleared her throat. We're going to adjourn for 10 minutes. When we return, this record will remain open, and we will proceed with the hearing as scheduled, unless Mr. Brooks has more to add at this time. Elijah closed the folder, slid it across the table slowly, and looked up one last time. "I have said everything that needed to be said. What happens next is up to all of you." As the room slowly began to rise, the mood was different now, heavier, more solemn. There were no side conversations, no awkward chuckles or shifting glances. Only reflection. Elijah stepped back from the table, turned, and made his way to a side door, not through the exit where Ray had dragged him earlier, but through a separate, private path reserved for federal witnesses. As he stepped through it, a young security officer stood there, silent, holding the door open. He looked up at Elijah, then down at the floor, as if unsure whether to speak. Then he finally said, "Sir. I'm sorry about what happened." Elijah paused, then placed a hand gently on the young man's shoulder. "Don't be sorry for what someone else chose to do. Just don't let it be normal. Don't let it pass you without asking why it happened." The guard nodded slowly, and Elijah walked on. Inside a small lounge behind the courtroom, Elijah sat down for a moment, alone now, breathing steadily, letting the silence finally settle around him. The adrenaline was still in his bloodstream, but it had faded into something steadier, conviction. He knew this wasn't over. He knew that cameras were still rolling, phones still buzzing, stories already beginning to circulate. But he also knew that what had just happened would be felt across every office, every precinct, every agency that pretended these moments were anomalies. There was a knock at the door. A tall woman stepped in, gray blazer, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Brooks, we've just been informed the press is already outside the courthouse. They want a statement. Do you want us to decline on your behalf?" Elijah looked up slowly, his face unreadable for a moment. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward her. "No," he said quietly. "I'll speak. But not for them. For everyone else who's ever had to prove they belonged in a place they already earned the right to be." As he walked down the hallway toward the courthouse steps, each footstep echoed not just off the walls but into the memories of everyone who had watched what happened. The confrontation. The silence. The revelation. But what they hadn't seen yet, was the response that was about to reach far beyond one building. Because what Elijah Brooks had just done wasn't only historic. It was just the beginning. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown beyond what any media outlet expected. What began as a local briefing turned into a national spectacle within hours. Journalists who had arrived with talking points on cybersecurity now clutched notebooks filled with quotes about racial profiling, systemic failure, and unexpected courage. Their camera lenses weren't pointed at podiums, they were aimed at a single man walking calmly down the courthouse steps with the kind of poise that made you forget the chaos around him. Elijah wasn't smiling. He wasn't angry either. He wore the face of someone who had waited a long time for the world to look at something it didn't want to see. His presence spoke louder than any press release. And as he stepped up to the microphone set outside the courthouse doors, a hush fell over the entire block. The silence felt sacred, almost reverent, not because the crowd knew exactly what he would say, but because they knew whatever it was, it would matter. He didn't speak immediately. He let the pause linger, the weight of it giving space for people to feel instead of just react. Then he raised his eyes to meet the crowd and began in a voice that wasn't dramatic, but unmistakably deliberate. He didn't start with anger. He didn't start with the facts. He started with the cost. The cost of being assumed guilty. The cost of staying silent. The cost of choosing dignity over destruction. "This isn't about a badge," he said. "This is about the quiet, daily decisions made in places like this. The choice to look at someone and reduce them to what you're afraid of. The choice to protect the system over the individual. And the choice, which I made today, to hold a mirror up to all of it, because we cannot fix what we refuse to see." The crowd didn't erupt. They listened. Because Elijah wasn't giving them a performance. He was giving them a window. Behind him, cameras zoomed in on his face, trying to capture something deeper than the soundbite. They were searching for the human cost in his eyes, and they found it. The weight of years carrying restraint. The pressure of knowing that even in victory, he was still part of a system built to test his patience, not his potential. He spoke for another 6 minutes. No script. No teleprompter. Just the truth, layered with both pain and resolve. When he finished, he stepped away from the microphone, ignoring shouted questions and calls for follow-ups. He had said enough. Inside the courthouse, a very different conversation was happening. Senior officials were already on calls with their superiors. Statements were being drafted. The folder Elijah had presented was being copied and marked for internal review. But more importantly, something intangible had shifted. People were looking at each other differently. Whispered conversations had taken on a sharper edge. Employees were checking their inboxes for messages they once ignored. A young paralegal sat alone in a conference room, staring at the coffee she hadn't touched, replaying everything she had witnessed that morning. In the break room, 2 federal attorneys debated whether the silence of good people did more damage than the actions of one corrupt officer. It wasn't just about Dempsey anymore. It was about everyone who'd ever stood by quietly and let someone like him keep walking. Ray Dempsey, meanwhile, sat alone in a small white-walled office inside the Internal Affairs Division of Courthouse Operations. His badge and firearm had already been taken. His phone was placed in a clear plastic bag. Across from him sat a woman from the DOJ, clipboard in hand, voice calm but firm. "You are being formally investigated under Federal Code 42-91C for discriminatory behavior while acting under the authority of government," she said, flipping through her notes. "We're not asking you how you feel. We're asking for facts." Ray's face was pale, but the arrogance hadn't completely faded. "I was doing my job," he muttered. "Following protocol." The woman raised her eyes. "You didn't check his ID. You didn't ask his name. You placed cuffs on a decorated intelligence officer without probable cause. You don't need protocol. You need accountability." The room held its breath. Ray looked away. Back in Elijah's private vehicle, the mood was still and reflective. He sat quietly, staring out the window, watching as the buildings of Washington slid past. His aide sat next to him, a tablet in hand, but not speaking. Finally, she said softly, "Sir, your daughter's school called." She watched the live stream. Elijah turned to look at her, the first sign of emotion breaking across his face since the hearing. "Did she say anything?" he asked. The aide nodded. "She said she was proud. But she also asked why they put handcuffs on her dad." That sentence landed deeper than anything that day. Elijah didn't reply right away. He turned his gaze back to the window, the cityscape now blurred by the quiet ache behind his eyes. This wasn't a political statement anymore. This was personal. It always had been. The hardest part wasn't exposing the system. It was explaining the damage it had done, to people who were still too young to understand why the world treats some names like credentials, and others like threats. Meanwhile, the fallout continued. Articles were already climbing news feeds. Headlines blurred between praise and outrage. Some commentators praised Elijah for his restraint, calling him a modern symbol of dignity under fire. Others accused him of staging the moment for attention, questioning whether he used his position for personal gain. But none of that mattered to Elijah. Because he hadn't done this to be liked. He did it because it was overdue. And he knew, in the quiet spaces behind closed doors, other people who looked like him were watching, waiting to see if truth could stand up in a room full of power and still be heard. What made this moment more complicated was that it wasn't a clear victory. Elijah had used his influence to expose a broken practice, yes. But he had also revealed how fragile that influence really was. How quickly credentials became invisible when someone refused to look. How dignity was still conditional in rooms where it should have been guaranteed. And now, he was facing a new wave of moral weight. What was next? Would he keep working inside a system that had just tried to erase him? Could he keep advocating for change from within? Or was it time to demand something more? Something louder? The dilemma wasn't just personal, it was philosophical. Stay and fix what was broken, or step away and create something better. As the car pulled into a secured government facility, Elijah's mind drifted not to what he had said, but to what he hadn't. The truths he held back. The stories he chose not to tell. Not because they weren't real, but because if he released them all at once, the damage might be too much to repair. Sometimes, exposing the truth isn't about burning everything down. Sometimes, it's about forcing others to rebuild it with you, brick by reluctant brick. Inside the building, a closed-door meeting was underway. Leaders from multiple agencies had gathered to discuss the implications of what had happened. Policies were being re-evaluated. Officers were being retrained. And somewhere on the list, Elijah's name was being brought up for a promotion that had previously been shelved, quietly, discreetly, with a note that read, "Unmatched leadership in crisis." But Elijah hadn't asked for that. He didn't need a promotion. He needed assurance. Not for himself. But for every person who wouldn't be in that room when decisions were made. For those who would walk the same halls, flash the same ID, speak with the same confidence, and still be asked to prove they belonged. The sun had begun to set when Elijah finally stepped into his office. It was quiet. His assistant left a stack of folders on his desk, a note taped to the top. "You changed something today," it read. We all felt it. He sat down slowly, his body heavy with exhaustion, not from physical strain, but from the emotional weight of standing still while the world judged whether you were worthy. He looked around the room, photos of his daughter, commendations from missions abroad, plaques with titles and seals, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel pride when he looked at them. He felt urgency. He picked up a pen. Opened a blank folder. And wrote 4 words on the cover. "This starts with us." Because the real question now wasn't what had happened. The office was bathed in the faint amber glow of early evening, the kind of light that casts long, thoughtful shadows across a room. Elijah remained seated at his desk, pen still in hand, staring at the folder before him as though it held more than just paper, it held possibility, weight, responsibility. The hum of the ventilation system was the only noise in the room. A soft knock at the door broke the stillness, and without looking up, Elijah said, "Come in." The door opened slowly, and Ava, his aide of 5 years, stepped in with careful footsteps, her voice low but sincere. "They're requesting you back at the courthouse tomorrow. Press is still waiting on an official comment about the investigation. DOJ says they'll release a statement in the morning, but everyone wants to hear from you again." Elijah set the pen down and leaned back in his chair, his fingers pressing into the arms as he stared out the window. "They already heard enough," he said quietly. Ava walked closer, her heels soft against the carpet, and rested the tablet she carried on the edge of his desk. "They heard your truth. But now they want to know what happens next. You changed something, Elijah. You know that, right?" He turned his gaze toward her, eyes tired but clear. "That's the problem. They think something changed in a moment. But this didn't start today, and it won't end tomorrow. This isn't a chapter. It's the whole book." Ava hesitated before speaking again. "The president called. His chief of staff wants to schedule a meeting with you this week. Privately. They're watching how this unfolds. You've got momentum, Elijah. You've got leverage." He let out a soft breath, almost a sigh, and replied, "I don't want leverage. I want alignment. I want people in those offices to finally stop asking if racism is real and start asking how they've contributed to it." She nodded slowly, understanding his exhaustion, then paused before saying, "And what do you want to tell your daughter when she asks why you went back to work the next day?" That question landed hard. Elijah looked down at his hands, large and steady, the same ones that had held his daughter's face while he explained why sometimes doing everything right still meant getting treated like you didn't belong. "She needs to know I didn't walk away from this because it got hard," he said quietly. "She needs to see that change takes more than one brave moment. It takes consistency. And I need her to know that her father didn't just speak the truth. He lived it." Ava placed a hand gently on his shoulder, then turned to leave, stopping at the door. "Whatever you decide, we've got your back. All the way." The door clicked shut behind her. Hours passed and the office grew darker, the city's lights blinking on one by one outside the window. Elijah stayed still for a long time, lost in thought, replaying moments from the day in sharp clarity, the pressure of the cuffs, the judgment in the officer's eyes, the silence in the room when the truth was finally spoken aloud. But it wasn't just the injustice that haunted him, it was the knowing. Knowing that for every time he had the platform to fight back, thousands of others never did. That for every headline bearing his name, there were dozens of names buried in silence. His phone buzzed gently beside him. A text from Mia. Just one sentence. "Daddy, did you fix it?" He stared at the screen for a long time. How do you explain to a 10-year-old that you can confront injustice and still not be sure if anything really changed? That you can win a battle and still lose pieces of yourself in the fight? He typed slowly. "I'm trying, baby girl. I'm trying every day." The next morning came with a wave of noise, media vans parked outside his building, journalists lining the sidewalk, political analysts filling news cycles with speculation. Inside, the agency was buzzing, staff members moving faster than usual, some offering nods of respect that hadn't existed before. Elijah arrived early, walked past the whispers, and made his way to a secured meeting room where senior leadership awaited him. As he stepped inside, a circle of men and women rose to greet him, not out of ceremony, but out of recognition. The deputy director began. "Elijah, I want to say what should have been said long ago. We failed you. Not just yesterday. But in every meeting we sat in and didn't speak up. In every moment we looked the other way. You gave us more than your service. You gave us your silence, when we didn't deserve it. And now you've given us your voice. And we heard it." Another official leaned in, voice tense. "What you did yesterday, the way you exposed all of it, it sparked something we can't put back in the bottle. There are demands for audits across multiple buildings. Congressional interest is rising. And yes, it's uncomfortable. But maybe discomfort is exactly what we needed." Elijah listened, his expression unreadable, then said, "Discomfort isn't the goal. It's the consequence. Accountability is the goal. And if we can't do that within our own walls, then we have no business talking about protecting the country from anything outside of them." The room fell quiet. There was no rebuttal. Just acknowledgement. Then the room's mood shifted as the deputy director added, "There's something else. Ray Dempsey, he submitted a written statement this morning. Not a defense. A confession. He admitted to acting out of bias. Said your reaction forced him to see himself clearly for the first time. It's being processed as part of the DOJ's investigation. He's cooperating fully." Elijah was surprised, but not moved. Remorse is a beginning. It's not enough. It has to be followed by change. Not just from him, but from all of you. As the meeting closed, Elijah was asked to prepare a new internal program, a cultural integrity initiative aimed at training all federal officers in racial de-escalation, unconscious bias, and ethical response. He would lead it. With full backing. Full resources. Full visibility. But he had a decision to make. That night, back home, Elijah stood in the kitchen while Nia finished her homework at the table. She looked up, her eyes wide, hopeful. "Did they say sorry?" she asked. He nodded. "Some of them did." She thought about that for a moment. "Are they gonna change?" Elijah looked at her long and hard. They're going to try. And we're going to help them. But it'll take time. She slid her notebook toward him. Can I help too? And in that moment, Elijah smiled, genuine, tired, but real. You already are. He tucked her into bed an hour later, kissed her forehead, and sat at the edge of her mattress. I want you to remember something, he said. When someone tells you that you don't belong in a room, you tell them you're not asking for permission. You're claiming space that was always yours. You lead with truth. And you stand tall, even if you're standing alone. Back in his office later that night, Elijah opened the folder he'd labeled the day before. He added a second sheet. 4 more words. Truth leads. Fear follows. He knew what he had to do. And in the morning, the world would find out exactly what that meant. The next morning, Elijah stood at the edge of the stage inside the largest federal auditorium in the district. Rows of chairs were already filled, federal employees, journalists, senior officers, interns, clerks, people who had heard his name over the last 72 hours and decided they needed to see the man who had turned a routine security breach into a national reckoning. There were no decorations. No banners. Just a seal on the wall behind him, and a microphone. He stood in silence for a few seconds longer than expected, allowing the room to quiet itself not through command, but through presence. When he finally began to speak, it wasn't with the fire of someone demanding change, but with the weight of someone who had lived too long in its absence. He started not with the courthouse or the investigation, but with a story from his childhood, being pulled aside by a teacher who mistook him for a student skipping class. How he was led down the hallway by the wrist, made to sit in the principal's office while the other boy who had actually cut class walked past unnoticed. He said he remembered the look in that teacher's eyes, certainty, not malice. And how that certainty stuck with him longer than the actual event. It wasn't the punishment that stayed with me, he said softly, it was the assumption that I had done something wrong just by being there. The audience was locked in. No one checked their phones. No one whispered. He continued, that same feeling followed me into boardrooms, into missions, into this city, and yes, into that courthouse last week. He paced slowly, not out of nervousness but out of intention. We've created environments where the silence of good people allows flawed systems to thrive. And we've told ourselves that professionalism means neutrality. That speaking up means rocking the boat. But let me ask you this, if the boat only carries some of us safely, why do we protect it? From the second row, a young man blinked back tears. A woman in uniform next to him reached for her notebook, not to take notes, but to steady her hand. Elijah's voice never rose, but it carried as though amplified by truth itself. What happened to me in that courthouse wasn't rare. It was routine. The only difference is I had the tools to expose it. Most people don't. Most people carry it. Quietly. Every day. And that weight changes how you walk into rooms. How you speak. How you see yourself. His voice caught for a moment, but he didn't look away. And that's not just unfair. That's unacceptable. The auditorium held its breath as Elijah paused, then continued. So, here's what we're going to do. Not just today. Not just while the cameras are watching. We are going to rewrite the policy on officer discretion in federal buildings. We are going to launch a new standard of training, designed not just to protect buildings, but to protect dignity. And yes, I'm going to lead it. Not because I want the spotlight, but because I refuse to let someone else's silence write the next version of this story. After the address, there was no standing ovation. Just silence. The good kind. The kind that says people are thinking. Processing. Questioning. Elijah walked off the stage quietly, stepping into the hallway where his team waited. Ava handed him a bottle of water and asked softly, "How do you feel?" He gave her a tired smile. "Like I'm still at the beginning." She nodded, understanding. The DOJ released their formal report an hour ago. It's trending. He didn't ask what it said. He didn't need to. Ava continued, Dempsey requested a meeting. Off the record. He says he wants to talk to you. Elijah's eyes narrowed slightly, not with suspicion, but with consideration. Where? Ava hesitated. He's downstairs. In the mediation room. The room was small. Neutral-colored walls. One table. 2 chairs. No cameras. No microphones. Just quiet. Elijah stepped inside, and for a long moment, neither man spoke. Ray Dempsey stood slowly. He looked different now, thinner, older somehow. His eyes didn't carry the same authority, but they carried something heavier. Consequence. He extended his hand, and Elijah looked at it, then slowly shook it. Ray sat down first. Elijah followed. The silence stretched, then Ray finally spoke. I thought about starting this with an apology. But I've said the word sorry more in the last 3 days than I've said in the last decade, and none of it feels like enough. Elijah didn't respond. He waited. Ray took a breath. You didn't just change the way I see people. You changed the way I see myself. And it hurts. It hurts to realize that I wore that uniform thinking I was the good guy. Thinking I was fair. Just. That I was protecting people. But I wasn't. Not always. Sometimes, I was protecting me. My pride. My power. He looked down at his hands. When I saw you that day, I didn't see a threat. I saw a man who didn't need me. Who didn't flinch. And I reacted to that. I took your presence as defiance. Because deep down, I didn't want you to remind me that I didn't earn your respect. I wanted to take it. The room felt heavier now. Elijah finally spoke. That's what this is about, Ray. Not your badge. Not your title. But your choices. The small ones. The automatic ones. The ones that say more than anything written in a report. Ray nodded slowly, then looked up. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just want you to know. I'm not going to disappear. I'm going to stay in this conversation. Even if I'm not in the uniform. Even if I never wear it again. Elijah leaned forward. That's the only apology that matters. Not in words. But in presence. In persistence. Ray swallowed hard. Then I'll stay. And I'll listen. Even when it stings. When Elijah stepped back out into the hallway, he felt something different. Not closure. But continuation. There were still calls to return, reports to finalize, policies to draft. But for the first time in years, he felt like the conversation had finally started. The real one. The one that didn't shrink from discomfort, but leaned into it. Later that afternoon, he met with a group of junior officers. Young, bright, diverse. Their eyes were wide, not with fear, but with hope. One of them, a woman with braids tucked beneath her cap, stood and asked, Sir, when did you know this was your fight? Elijah looked around the room. Then smiled gently. When I realized I was no longer okay with being tolerated. When I decided I deserved to be respected. As they nodded, something passed between them. A torch. A promise. A belief that the next generation wouldn't be handed the silence Elijah had been forced to break. That maybe, just maybe, they'd inherit a system worth standing in. Because Elijah hadn't just survived the system. He was rebuilding it. One truth at a time. 6 months later, the landscape had shifted more than anyone expected. The courtroom incident that once echoed through newsrooms and agency briefings had become a landmark case study at federal training academies. Elijah Brooks had quietly declined several national awards and declined every morning show interview request. He didn't need praise. What he needed was permanence. And that's exactly what he focused on building. The cultural integrity program he had designed wasn't just another diversity initiative buried under bureaucratic slogans, it was now mandatory training across all Department of Justice facilities. Elijah personally led the first 3 sessions, not with slides or scripts, but through real stories, uncomfortable truths, and face-to-face conversations that stripped away the distance between policy and personhood. He looked trainees in the eye and asked them not how they would protect buildings, but how they would protect the people walking through them. Not just the familiar faces. All of them. Ray Dempsey, after the conclusion of the internal investigation, was officially dismissed from federal duty. But instead of disappearing into obscurity, he made an unexpected choice. He joined a grassroots organization that focused on dismantling systemic bias in local enforcement. He didn't join as a spokesperson. He showed up as a volunteer. Cleaning, listening, learning. For months, he spoke at small town halls, never asking for applause. He never used Elijah's name to validate his efforts. He simply showed up and stayed in the discomfort, one silent hour after another. It didn't erase what he had done, but it shifted what came next. And that shift, even if small, had meaning. Ava was promoted shortly after the dust settled. With Elijah's support, she took leadership over the newly formed Office for Internal Ethical Response, overseeing integrity investigations across multiple sectors. She ran it not with aggression but with sharp compassion, firm, fair, unrelenting. Her voice became one of the most respected in the department, and she made it a point to recruit young professionals who had been ignored for far too long. For her, change wasn't about volume. It was about precision. And she wielded it like a scalpel, cutting out the rot, stitch by stitch. Nia, Elijah's daughter, had grown quiet confidence over those months. Her school had invited Elijah to speak during Black History Month, and she had introduced him herself in front of her classmates. "My dad didn't just fight back. He showed people how to stop fighting each other," she said into the microphone, her voice steady, her eyes full of pride. Elijah had never felt more seen. Not by officials, not by press, but by his daughter. And that, more than any policy, more than any change, was his legacy. Elijah's own path evolved into something no one had anticipated. A year after the incident, he received a letter from a bipartisan group of legislators requesting his leadership on a new federal advisory board for law enforcement reform. It wasn't a political position. It was a structural one. He accepted, not for the title, but for the access. And he used that access with clarity, never diluting his voice to fit the room. When resistance came, he welcomed it. "Change without resistance isn't real," he once told the committee. "It just means no one was paying attention." Over time, his presence redefined what leadership looked like. Not performative, not corporate. But principled. Rooted. Consistent. But the most surprising part of his journey wasn't the policies or the programs. It was the ripple. Stories like his began surfacing from other cities. Moments of reckoning where individuals refused to stay silent. Court officers began asking harder questions. Employees started sharing their experiences without fear. Young people in training academies referenced his name when asked why they chose the path of public service. Not because he was perfect. But because he was clear. One morning, walking through the same courthouse corridor where everything had unraveled, Elijah paused. The walls were the same. The lighting hadn't changed. But something felt different. A security officer nodded to him, not with formality, but with familiarity. "Morning, Director Brooks," he said, respectfully, no stiffness in his voice. Just a man greeting another. Elijah nodded back and walked on, feeling the presence of everything that had changed, not in headlines, but in moments like that. Small, clean, human moments. He eventually returned to that same courtroom where it had all begun. This time, not in crisis, but as a speaker at a graduation for new federal officers. He stood at the podium, looked out over the room, and told them what no textbook could teach. Every day you wear that badge, you are choosing who gets to feel safe and who gets to feel watched. Make the right choice. Especially when it's hard. Especially when no one is looking. Because that's when it matters most. And when he stepped down, the applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It was steady, meaningful. The kind that says, "We heard you." And maybe that's how real change begins. Not with a roar, but with a shift. Now, if you've stayed with this story until now, I want to ask you something. How many times have you walked past something wrong because it wasn't happening to you? How often have you seen injustice dressed as routine? Think about Elijah. Think about Ray. Think about the people in your own world who are carrying silent battles no one asks about. And now ask yourself, what kind of space are you creating? Who do you make feel seen? Who do you make feel small? This wasn't just a story about a man in a suit and a cop with a badge. This was a mirror. And maybe, just maybe, it's reflecting something we all need to confront. Let us know in the comments, what moment from this story hit you hardest? What would you have done in Elijah's place? Or Ray's? What does accountability look like in your world? And if stories like this speak to your soul, if you believe in the power of truth, redemption, and perspective, then don't leave without hitting that subscribe button. Join us here on Tales of Twist, where every story challenges you to feel deeper, question louder, and never settle for silence. We'll see you in the next story.